This video covers openers, middles, and closers. These ideas come from John Trimble's book, Writing with Style, which is about creating flow in your essay. So to start with, his main concept is that every part of your essay needs to go together. So we start with openers, and the essential components for an opener, or an introduction as we generally call it, is that you need to have a hook to grab the reader's attention. You want something that will pull the reader in immediately so that they are interested in reading more. We also need any kind of context that will help us understand later information. So his other major concept that he covers in this book is that you need to order the information in the order that we need to understand it. So if there's something more complex later on, we need to have the basic stuff first. So then obviously the last thing that you want in your opener or introduction is your thesis statement. Now we talk about in our class that you want to have your thesis as the last sentence of the introduction paragraph. So that's where you want to put that thesis statement, and the thesis needs to be specific to your essay and focus everything at that point. There are 4 things that Trimble tells us to do in the introduction. First, grab the reader's attention and interest them in reading more. Second, introduce your main idea. So if we can't tell what your paper is about by the end of the introduction paragraph, then there's a problem. Signal what direction your essay will take. So that's the focus part of it, that we've been talking about in class. And that is part of your thesis statement, making sure that we understand, how are you going to manage this information? What direction are we going with it? And then especially if you have a large topic, what are the specific things that you're going to cover? And then also setting the tone for your essay. How are you going to deal with this information? How serious is it going to be? How academic is it going to be? Or is it going to be a little bit more lighthearted? Depending on your topic, you may have several options there for the tone. So here's some ideas for getting that introduction started. This is a general idea that most books will tell us is a good option, and that's called the inverted triangle. So the inverted triangle is where you start with a broad idea and then narrow it down to your specific main point. So this example here, you can see we start off with a broad idea that most people can relate to, so that people mature, they often dream of having children, and then we narrow down to the specific argument, which is about surrogacy. So you can pause the video if you need to read the whole thing, but the idea is that you start off with a statement that will connect to your reader and then narrow down slowly, each sentence getting more and more focused to the final focus sentence, which is your thesis. Another idea is to grab the reader's attention with a story or anecdote. This may be an actual story, something from a case study, something from an article of an actual person, or it may be an anecdote that is a story that you have created, or it may be a personal story. But the idea is that you approach it like a narrative. You're telling the story. You include that description and that narration of the story, and then you lead into your thesis with a transition. And then similar to that is a description. A description would be a vivid picture of what you're writing about to set the tone for your reader. And that is a similar idea, although instead of like telling a story, like a linear story, you're just describing something. So this works really well for topics that are related to places or objects or something, so you can describe it for the reader. And if you have a really good description with lots of sensory detail, it can really pull the reader in, and then again transition into that thesis. Another idea for you at the beginning is a question, especially if it's a provocative question. The main thing is making sure that we're not using excessive amount of a second person, and then we only ask one question, especially that if it's a question that we can actually answer within the essay. We don't want to ask questions that are not ones that will be covered in the essay. Dramatically brief statements are another way that you can compel your reader. These would be really short sentences. You can see the example here from Hamlet. And so this would be something that if you have a kind of a dramatic topic, this would be a good option for you. And so you may consider playing around with sentence length at the beginning. And then the other idea is that quotations work really well, especially if it's a compelling quote that is interesting, something to get your reader to think about a little bit further. This example shows you a quote that's separated from the rest of the text, that is above the text and in italics. You may have read books like this where you'll get to a chapter and there'll be a quote above the chapter before it starts. And so this idea is that you include something that will get them reading and then or thinking, and then they get into the reading after that. So this is an option for you. You can also put the quote within the first sentence as part of the essay, and that's fine too. But then you'll want to provide a little bit more context for the quotation itself. So those are your ideas to start your essay. Now we want to move on to the middles. The middles are the most important part of your essay, really, because this is where the content is. This is where the majority of your grade is. And so we want to make sure that you are really thinking about how can you make this something that will connect together. So this quote from John Trimble is that good writers are sticklers for continuity. So we want a sentence that's clearly connected to the previous one and then the one after that. And that is one of the most difficult things to do as a writer, is make sure that everything connects together. So we're trying to create flow in your writing. And so that's why we're talking about it at this point, because you have so much experience with writing so far. We want to make sure that you are really focused on how to make your writing even better by including all of those little things like transitions and signposting, which I'll talk about, and making sure that your essay goes from one to the next and it's logical. So one of the ways to do that is what we call the so what question. The so what question asks you to focus on the question, so what? So every time you include something in your essay, you want to ask yourself, so what? So what might be, why is this example important? What does this have to do with the thing that I'm talking about in this paragraph? What does this have to do with the previous quote that I just included? How does it tie to your thesis? How does it tie to anything, really? So what does this quote add to your discussion? So every time you include something, you want to ask yourself, how does this tie in? Because you want to make sure that the language that you're using, both before it and after it, makes it connect to what you're talking about. So I see this all the time where students will put a quote in there and then the sentence immediately after the quote just moves on. It does not tell us why we should read the quote. It doesn't tell us what the quote adds. It doesn't tell us what we should learn from the quote. And so that's one of the things where if you're going to include a quotation, really the sentence before it and the sentence after it need to tie it to the discussion. And so that's why quotations are so important to include, because not only do we have that additional, this is the research that I've done, we also have that connection that you can make with 3 sentences, essentially. So it makes your paper longer, is what I'm getting at. So you want to make sure that you're doing that. The other thing you want to be thinking about is what you're doing with expository writing. So your primary goal with expository writing is informative. You want the reader to understand, and you want to approach it as the reader probably doesn't know much about your topic. So we need lots of information. But we also have this secondary goal to persuade, and that is to get the reader to understand a point by the end of the essay. So every sentence needs to be in your essay for a reason. It needs to have a point to it so that by the end of the essay, we have really understood what you're trying to say about the topic. So we have a very focused way of approaching the topic, and that means that everything needs to be in your paper for a reason. So checklist for you, just to kind of make sure that you're doing things correctly. Make sure your essay has a sure sense of your audience, whether that's Comp 2 students, whether that's even more of a refined audience, that's fine. But you want to be thinking of your audience as having the reading level of a Comp 2 classroom, and that will help a little bit with the type of vocabulary you should use. Make sure you have a well-defined thesis that's specific to your essay. Make sure you have a clear strategy for how you're going to go through the information, all of that strong evidence in there, as well as a clean narrative line. And what that means is thinking about your essay sort of like a story. What do we need to understand first before we get to some of the later information that you'll provide? So making sure that everything is in a logical order. And then that conclusion, that closing, needs to make sure it wraps everything up and really defines that main point that you're trying to make, or that assertion. So one of the other ways that you can do this is by adding in good, strong bridge sentences. Bridge sentences help link information from previous paragraphs to new paragraphs. And so we'll go at the beginning of each paragraph, be thinking that first sentence needs to consider what came before it, and then what's going to come in this paragraph. So you want to focus just on one main point per paragraph, and that can help you define your points and make sure that they're developed and balanced. So there's a couple of examples here from Bergen Evans' article from But What's a Dictionary For? So if he has a sentence that's, but what underlies all this sound and fury? This is a question. So the first sentence of a paragraph, you are anticipating the answer to the question as the paragraph. But then, since the question is what underlies all this sound and fury, the previous paragraph would be about what comes behind it, whatever the sound and fury is. So monstrous discrepancy in evaluation requires us to examine the basic principles. This is a strategy where basically the first half of the sentence covers what was in the previous paragraph, and then the second half of the sentence covers what will be in this paragraph. So we know we're covering the basic principles here. And then this one is a comparative transition. So we have, but more subtly but persuasively, it's changed under the influence of mass education and growth of democracy. So we know that we have this comparison. We're covering the change from education and democracy in this paragraph, but the previous paragraph was about something that we could compare it to. And then here's a further example is if you're just providing a paragraph that's going to cover an example or an illustration, then you can just introduce it with a sentence that tells us that this is an illustration. So these are just different examples of those bridge sentences that help us to move forward effectively in your essay. Signposting is another technique, and that is where you lead your reader through your essay by hinting what's going to happen. So if you have 3 examples, you're going to tell us that you have 3 examples, and then you're going to number them. If you're going to order your examples by strength or by complexity or something like that, then tell us that in the language that you use. So this finally and most seriously would be a good transition to use. So making sure that you're identifying when you are covering a certain number of things, making sure that you are letting us know the order that you've chosen by the words that you use. Other transition words, there's a ton of good transitions out there, and I'm always suggesting more transitions for students because that tends to be where we drop off, because we don't tend to think in transitions, but we want to read in transitions. So making sure that each sentence really feels like it belongs there in that specific spot. Another technique that you can use is in this particular essay are headers. You can use headers in this paper as long as you have them in bold font with Roman numerals, and that you are using them sparingly. So there shouldn't be one before the introduction, and there needs to be a transition between each section. And you can only use primary headers. I don't want a bunch of headers, but you think of like maybe your 3 main sections of your essay. So don't use one in front of every single paragraph. Just your main sections. So this example here, you can see if my introduction talks about geography and history for this place, then my first section is going to be on geography. I'm going to have several paragraphs. You have to imagine there's several paragraphs here, and then history will be the second section, and you can add more. So I might put geography of Saskatchewan or something like that. And so you'll have several paragraphs within each section, but those headers are allowed in this essay to help keep you organized and help keep your reader organized. You can also use long quotations in this essay. They're called block quotes. They really don't have as much to do with organization, but they are something that you can add just to add content to your essay and to add, especially if you find a really good block quote that's interesting, where the language is different or unique, then you can definitely include that, but you want to make sure you're formatting it correctly. So in MLA formatting, the whole thing is double tabbed in, and it has to be longer than 4 of your typed lines before you offset it. You can only use 1 in this essay. So I want to emphasize that only 1 can be used. So use it sparingly, but use it to really include a good quotation. So this is an example of what it looks like. You have to imagine the whole thing's double spaced, and you can imagine then this is going to be a whole page by including such a long quote. So it's a way to make your paper longer, but it's also a way to add something that's really unique to your essay. And so the whole thing is double tabbed in so it looks like a block when you're done. So the last part then is to make sure that you're creating an effective conclusion for your essay. And we want to go back to what are we doing in the introduction? What are we doing in the middle? How can we make sure that that closing is just as good? So think of your closing, your conclusion as half summary and half conclusion. And the focus is on the main point. So you, instead of going back all the way to the thesis, think about what did you prove in the middle of your essay? How can you revisit that thesis by tying back to what you have actually provided evidence-wise in the essay itself? You can also include at least 1 new phrase to make your point memorable, but make sure that you're not including an actual new point or new information. So you want to end with some kind of emotional persuasive impact. This may mean coming up with a new phrasing, a new way of phrasing something, a new quote. Sometimes students will look for like a common saying that will fit in there. We want a strong ending thought. So here are a couple of ideas for that strong ending. You can echo the introduction by revisiting the hook and bringing the reader full circle. This is really useful for narratives, descriptions, or quotes. So you just kind of revisit it. You don't need to copy and paste it. You can rephrase it and then kind of refer back to it. But that helps us to come all the way back around and understand the importance of that, whatever was at the beginning. The second idea is to challenge the reader. This would be a new final thought or task for the reader to help to redirect the information. It also helps to apply it to their own lives, because sometimes it's hard to tell why we should care about something. So this example here is for how we should think about jury duty in a different way. And so you can see that we are trying to challenge the reader to think about something differently based on maybe some preconceived misconceptions they might have. The third idea is similar, but it's looking to the future. So what does it look like for the future of your topic? Why is this an important topic to talk about right now? It also helps the reader to apply this new information to their lives and see things more globally. So an example here with well-qualified teachers, making sure that we are looking to the future. If we don't have good teachers in the future, what's going to happen? And so it could be, in this case, it's a little bit dramatic, but because we're looking at the negative, but you could also look at the positive of what's happening in the future. So those are 3 ideas for your conclusion. There are lots of things to think about, but just making sure that you are connecting from the beginning all the way to the ending. That is what John Trimble's talking about in his book, and that is what this presentation has been about.